The fluorescent lights hummed overhead at Mercy General, that particular pitch only hospitals know, a sound that lives in your bones after the third double shift. Megan O'Brien's scrubs were damp at the collar from the Norfolk humidity that had followed her through the ER doors at 5:02 a.m., and the smell of stale coffee and antiseptic clung to her like a second skin. She'd been awake for 32 hours. Not unusual. The ER didn't keep kind hours, and neither did the people who staffed it. The locker room was empty this early. She moved through the rows of beige metal boxes with the muscle memory of someone who'd been doing this for 9 years, long enough to know every squeaking hinge, every combination that stuck. Her locker was in the back corner, deliberate choice, the kind of spot where you could dress and undress without witnesses. She spun the dial. 47. 19. 32. The door swung open with a soft metallic click. Her scrubs hung on the left side. Extra socks in the right pocket of her locker. A surgical mask in a plastic clip. And at the very bottom, hidden under a rolled-up surgical journal she never actually read, a pair of combat boots. The leather was cracked now, salt-stained from sweat and dust that would never quite wash out. The laces were frayed to threads. The toe box had been resoled twice. The rubber darkened where blood, old blood, someone else's blood, had soaked in and dried and soaked in again. She stared at them for 3 seconds. Just 3. Then she pushed the journal back over them and closed the door. Muscle memory. That was all the boots were now. A relic someone from another life had left behind. She was pulling her hair into a tight knot at the base of her skull when the trauma alert came through the overhead speaker. Not unusual. The alert system at Mercy General activated roughly every 38 minutes during day shift. But something in the dispatcher's tone, that edge of urgency that meant not just an accident but a priority patient, made her still her hands for half a second. Trauma alert. Mercy General. Incoming ETA 5 minutes. Navy training accident. Captain Reeves. Unresponsive. Altered respirations. Possible pneumothorax. Prepare Trauma Bay 1. Megan's hands finished the knot. Tucked the loose ends in. Checked her badge, still attached to the scrub pocket where she'd clipped it yesterday. The badge caught light from the hospital's harsh overheads. Megan O'Brien, RN. No rank. No history. Just a nurse in Norfolk who showed up on time and kept her head down and didn't ask questions about the things she knew other people didn't understand. The ER was already running hot when she pushed through the doors. Nurses coordinated with respiratory. Someone was calling for 2 units of O-negative to be rushed up from the blood bank. The trauma bay smelled like the sharp ozone bite of sanitizer and the faint metallic tang of blood from previous patients, never fully scrubbed away, just layered under disinfectant. The ventilator in Bay 1 wheezed its mechanical rhythm, waiting. She was gathering supplies when they brought him in. Stretcher moving fast, EMS crew calling vitals. We've got a 40-year-old male, training accident. He was running hard target search and took a heavy fall onto a concrete barrier. Megan's hand stopped moving. The patient's face was obscured by the oxygen mask, but his left shoulder was bare. Dark skin. And there, a birthmark. 8-sided shape. She'd seen that birthmark before. She'd knelt in Helmand Province dust 20 years ago and sheltered a child against her body as mortars fell from the sky, that same birthmark visible on the small shoulder she was trying to keep intact. She'd held him down while a combat medic worked. She'd told him in Pashto that he was going to be okay, he was going to live, someone was coming to get him. Someone had. The SEAL team that evacuated the village. The adoption paperwork that followed. The boy who was not a boy anymore. Captain Reeves. His breathing shallow, EMS was saying. Decreased breath sounds on the left side. We're thinking. Megan was already moving. Not triage. Not the standard protocol that Dr. Sterling had drilled into every nurse here, assessment first, vital second, intervention only after attending physician approval. She was pulling an acoustic stethoscope from the supply cart, and she was listening to his lungs, and what she heard was what she already knew, the silence on the left side that meant no air exchange, meant pressure building, meant a collapsed lung pressing on his heart. "Get me a 14-gauge needle," she said. "The doctor is on his way," someone, a tech, probably, said from somewhere across the room. "Now." The needle was in her hand. She was feeling for the landmarks, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, all of it automatic, all of it muscle memory from a life that didn't exist anymore. Her hands were steady. They'd always been steady when it mattered. That was when she felt the silence. The specific silence that means someone is watching. She looked up and saw Dr. Sterling standing in the doorway of the trauma bay, his face arranged in an expression of controlled disbelief. He was 53, distinguished looking in that way that came from expensive haircuts and the confidence of a man who'd never been told no by an institution that mattered. He had the kind of presence that made people wait for him to speak first. He was wearing a tie with tiny anchors on it, a clear signal that he'd decided today was a day to appear patriotic, and his hands were empty because he didn't carry supplies. He let other people carry supplies. "Dr. Sterling," the tech said, with the kind of relief that came from seeing authority arrive. Megan was still reaching for the needle. "Captain Reeves needs a needle decompression," she said. "We don't even have confirmation of pneumothorax," Sterling said. His voice was flat. Clinical. The kind of voice that was used to being obeyed. "And we certainly don't perform invasive procedures without proper imaging and..." His breath sounds are gone on the left. His O2 is dropping. "We don't have time for imaging. We have time for protocol, Nurse O'Brien." "Step back." She should have stepped back. She was trained to step back. She had spent 9 years learning how to be invisible, how to defer, how to let men with degrees make decisions while she stood behind them and cleaned up what came next. But the captain, the boy, the child she'd held in Sangin, was struggling to breathe. His oxygen saturation was probably around 72 by now. Maybe lower. His heart was compensating, working too hard, running out of time. One measured breath. She pressed the needle between the second and third ribs. The hiss of escaping air came like a sigh of relief. The captain gasped, his whole body shuddering. On the monitor, his oxygen saturation began to climb. 75. 80. 85. Climbing. "You overstepped," Sterling said. But he'd stopped moving forward. He was watching the monitor too. They were all watching the monitor now. His stabilizing, the respiratory tech breathed. Megan withdrew the needle. Gentle. Precise. The kind of movement that came from 9 years of nursing and 8 years before that of something else entirely. "We need a chest tube. An imaging to confirm." She looked at Sterling, at the small muscle that had tightened at the corner of his jaw. "Sir." The room felt very still. The fluorescent lights hummed their unchanging pitch. And in that silence, something invisible shifted. Sterling had come into the trauma bay expecting to save a patient. Instead, he'd watched a floor nurse take over his decision-making and be right. He turned and left without another word. Dr. Sterling's voice cut through the ER like a scalpel through tissue. His hands trembled, not from concern, but from rage at being contradicted, as he stalked toward the trauma bay where Megan stood beside Captain Reeves's bed. The captain's family clustered near the doorway, his sister's hand pressed to her mouth, his mother's eyes darting between the patient and the medical team. Sterling's jaw clenched as he locked onto Megan, his presence filling the small space like a storm front bearing down on flat ground. "Nurse O'Brien." He said her name like it tasted bad. "Perhaps you can explain to this family why a simple floor nurse thinks she can override my orders. In my ER. With my patient." The room went dead silent. Megan did not look up from the monitors. Her hands remained steady as she checked the oxygen saturation climbing on the screen, 88 now, holding steady. She'd already made her decision about how to respond, and it wasn't with defense or apology. "I'm listening, doctor," she said quietly. One measured breath. That was all she allowed herself. Sterling stepped closer, his voice dropping to the tone of a man used to being obeyed without question. His tailored coat, $1,200 wool, pressed to perfection, brushed against the equipment cart. You saw a patient in respiratory distress and decided protocol didn't apply to you. That's not nursing, nurse. That's recklessness. That's the kind of dangerous autonomy that gets people killed. He turned to face the captain's mother directly, his expression shifting into something rehearsed and sympathetic. Your son received excellent care from a trained physician. What he received from her was improvisation. We're fortunate the outcome was positive despite that interference. The captain's sister looked away. The mother's face had gone pale. They didn't know the needle decompression had saved his life. They didn't know the difference between someone reading protocols and someone living them. 3 other nurses had been charting nearby. Now they found sudden urgent business at the far end of the unit, their body language a synchronized turn away from the drama unfolding in the trauma bay. Megan noted this with the same clinical precision she brought to every observation. The distance was spreading. The silence was a choice. Sterling wasn't finished. He leaned against the monitor cart, crossing his arms like a judge settling in to deliver a sentence. I've been in medicine for 18 years. I know what expertise looks like. And what I saw today was a nurse who forgot her place in a hierarchy because a patient looked at her the wrong way. One word landed harder than the rest. Place. As in, know your place. As in, you don't belong at this level of decision-making. As in, you're only a nurse. Megan's hand moved to the monitor. She checked vitals again. Captain Reeves's oxygen holding at 91% now, his heart rate normalizing, his breathing steady and deep. She'd done that. Her decision. Her hands. Her experience earned in a desert 8,000 miles away, in situations where hesitation meant bodies in the sand. She took one measured breath. A single tear escaped her left eye. She saw it happen in the periphery of her vision like it belonged to someone else. Without changing expression, without breaking her focus on the monitors, she wiped it away with the back of her wrist. One movement. No trembling. No weakness. The tear was simply data, like everything else, information her body was processing and filing away. Then she turned and looked Sterling directly in the eye. I'd make the same call every time, Doctor. Because that man is alive. Her voice was barely above a whisper, which made it devastate the room more completely than any shout could have. Sterling's face went rigid. He wasn't used to being answered back. He wasn't used to being wrong in front of families who'd remember this interaction. He turned on his heel and left without another word, but not before she saw his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, a physical tell that the restraint she'd just demonstrated had cracked his careful composure. The next morning, a white sheet of paper materialized on the unit bulletin board. Printed. Official. With a timestamp of 6:22 a.m., Sterling must have printed it before anyone arrived for shift. Formal performance improvement notice. Staff member, M. The Brian, RN. Incident date, previous date. Citation, dangerous autonomy and insubordination. Violation of chain of command protocol. Overriding physician orders without authorization. Placing patient at risk through unauthorized intervention. Recommended action, mandatory retraining. Performance probation. Subject to further disciplinary action based on compliance. Dr. Richard Sterling, ER Medical Director. Megan read it once. Then again. The words didn't change. The institutional weight behind them, backed by Sterling's board connections, his reputation as a protocol enforcer, his ability to shape narratives about who was competent and who was a liability, felt like a physical pressure against her sternum. She took the notice down and folded it carefully into her pocket. The break room at 2:13 p.m. was supposed to be neutral ground. A place where the trauma of the ER fell away for 30 minutes and people could sit with bad coffee and the hum of the vending machine. Megan sat in her usual corner, the one near the window where she could watch the parking lot and the city beyond it. She had 12 minutes of her break left. Her sandwich remained untouched in front of her. 3 colleagues entered. Martinez, who'd worked with her for 3 years. Jackson, who'd borrowed Megan's stethoscope twice when hers went missing. And Chen, who Megan had trained on proper central line assessment 6 months ago. They saw her. Eyes made contact. The moment stretched into 2 seconds of recognition. Then, without a word, not a greeting, not a nod, not even the courtesy of acknowledgement, they turned and selected a table across the room. Deliberately. Methodically. They sat with their backs partially to her and began discussing a TV show with voices pitched just loud enough for her to hear that they weren't talking to her. The message was clear. Sterling had activated something beyond policy violations. He'd activated the social architecture of the hospital. You don't stand by someone the hierarchy has decided to punish. You don't sit with them. You don't validate them through proximity. Megan watched the city beyond the window. Norfolk spread out grey and indifferent in the afternoon light. Somewhere out there, a naval base carried forward the work she'd walked away from. Somewhere, people were making decisions that would ripple through lives. And here, in a break room that smelled like reheated coffee and industrial disinfectant, 3 people she'd worked alongside were practicing the art of forgetting they'd ever known her name. She picked up her sandwich and took a bite. It tasted like nothing. When her break ended, she returned to the floor and found that Sterling had reassigned her patients. She was relegated to administrative tasks, charting, supply inventory, the work usually given to nurses being phased out or punished. She moved through these assignments with the same precision she brought to everything, methodical, professional, without comment. But that night, as the ER settled into the controlled chaos of the evening shift, the monitors began their usual symphony of beeps and alarms. Somewhere in the building, someone was having a medical emergency. The hospital's heartbeat quickened. Megan stood at the supply station, hands moving through the motions of her assigned tasks, when she heard the code called over the intercom. Trauma Bay 3. Inbound. ETA for minutes. She didn't move. She wasn't assigned to trauma anymore. Sterling had made that clear. The doors burst open and the ambulance crew wheeled in a motorcycle accident victim, 23-year-old male, severe head trauma, open fracture left femur, estimated blood loss already critical. The paramedics were calling vitals with the urgent cadence that meant minutes, not hours. Maybe minutes, not days. Sterling appeared, already moving with purpose, already calling orders. Get him on the monitor. 2 large bore lines. Type and cross for 8 units. Orthopedics consult now. This was what he was good at, the organizational choreography, the commanding presence, the ability to mobilize a team. But as the patient came fully into view, Megan saw something that made her breath catch. The young man's pupils weren't responding evenly. One was blown, fixed and dilated while the other tracked the light reflexively. That meant increased intracranial pressure. That meant a brain bleeding against the skull, swelling with nowhere to go. That meant time had stopped being measured in hours. Sterling was ordering the wrong intervention. He was focused on the femur fracture, the obvious injury, the one that looked catastrophic. But the brain was dying. Megan saw the moment. She understood the decision tree. Neurosurgery consult. Stat CT, prepare for emergency craniotomy if there was bleeding in the epidural space. The golden hour for traumatic brain injury was already running out. She looked at Sterling. He was bent over the monitors, reading vitals, making his checklist. Competent within the framework he understood. Dangerous within the framework he didn't. The question rose in her like muscle memory, do I say something? Do I let this young man die so I don't violate the hierarchy? But she was already moving. She didn't decide to move. Her hands and her body decided for her, moving with the fluid precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Because she had. Because Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien had stood in a trauma facility at FOB Sangin Loga province with casualties stacking up faster than she could process them, making calls, saving lives, becoming the person the room turned to when seconds mattered. She was that person now, Even if this hospital didn't know it yet. Blown pupil on the left, she said, her voice different now, lower, flatter, more certain. Not a question. A statement. A command. Get neurosurgery on the phone. I need to know ETA for emergency CT. And someone prep for possible emergency craniotomy. Sterling looked up. His face went through 3 stages in 2 seconds. Surprise. Outrage. And something darker, the realization that she was doing it again, overriding him, taking authority he believed was exclusively his. But the room had already started moving. Because when someone speaks with that kind of absolute certainty about life and death, the body responds before the mind can argue about hierarchy. The next voice they heard wasn't Sterling's anymore. The captain's oxygen saturation alarm began its electronic wail at 2:38 p.m., and nothing else mattered after that moment. His eyes snapped open on the post-op recovery monitor, the kind of eyes that belonged to a man who'd survived things that would have broken ordinary people. Megan caught the shift from across the trauma bay, that subtle change in breathing pattern that meant danger was moving fast. His left chest had gone silent. No breath sounds. No whisper of air reaching the lung tissue. The ventilator was pushing oxygen into only one functioning side, and his sat was already sliding downward like a stone dropped into black water. 94. 91. 88. Dr. Sterling stood frozen 3 feet from the bed, his phone in one hand and his composure in the other, both slipping. He opened his mouth to call the surgical team, to activate some protocol that would buy him time, deflect responsibility, maintain the careful architecture of authority he'd constructed. His fingers hovered over the screen. His jaw worked soundlessly. He was calculating the liability, the explanation he'd need to offer, the way this crisis would look on his record when the board reviewed the post-operative timeline. In the silence of his hesitation, a man was suffocating in front of him. Megan moved. Not quickly in the way civilians understood speed, but with the kind of precise motion that came from thousands of hours making split-second decisions when split seconds meant whether somebody's son came home alive. She was already moving before her conscious mind had finished registering what her body already knew. Her hand found the 14-gauge needle with the same certainty that her body had once found rifle triggers in sandstorms. The landmark was automatic, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Between the ribs. Anatomy became map and she was the compass. Tension pneumothorax, she said, and the words emerged in a voice that belonged to someone else entirely. Not the deferential nurse who apologized for existing. The voice of someone who had made these calls while rounds were impacting, while dust was still settling, while bodies were still moving around her. The command voice. The one that made people comply before their thinking brains caught up. I need this patient now. The captain's trachea had begun its subtle shift to the right, the sign that pressure was building in his chest cavity like a fist clenching around his lung. 75% saturation now. The numbers were plummeting. Megan's hands moved on their own, the muscle memory overriding the person who wore scrubs and kept her combat boots hidden in a locker. The needle went in with the precise angle taught by 18 years of trauma protocol and 20 more years before that. The rush came immediately, the sudden hiss of air escaping, like a tire deflating, like pressure releasing, like a man getting his life back 1 millimeter at a time. The sound filled the entire room. Nobody moved. The needle had breached the pleural space and the accumulated air that had been collapsing his lung now had somewhere to escape. Oxygen saturation jumped immediately. 82. 86. 90. She was already reaching for the catheter to secure it, to keep that pressure from building again, her movements economical and absolute. The captain's eyes locked onto hers for 1 second, recognition and something else, some kind of acknowledgement that lived in a space beyond words. He gasped in air. Real air. Lungs filling. The kind of breathing that meant living. 93. 96. Stable. Dr. Sterling's hands were shaking, but not from relief. The trembling came from somewhere deeper, from the part of him that understood he had just watched someone else do the thing he couldn't do, the thing that would be recorded and reported and analyzed in every subsequent case review. His phone was still in his hand. He'd never managed to dial. He was staring at Megan with an expression that mixed fury and humiliation in a ratio that made the fluorescent lights overhead seem brighter and harsher than they had any right to be. "Get the surgical team," Megan said, and it wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She was already running one hand along the captain's left side, palpating for subcutaneous emphysema, for any other signs that pressure was still building. Her other hand was checking the catheter placement with a kind of meticulous attention that said she'd done this before. Many times. In circumstances Sterling would never understand. A young resident named Chen started moving toward the phone, then hesitated, looking at Sterling. The hierarchy was fracturing in real time. The doctor who'd been teaching them all that protocol was law had just frozen while the floor nurse had made a diagnosis and executed a procedure that saved a man's life in approximately 40 seconds. Something had shifted in the room's atmosphere, something fundamental about who commanded authority and who merely wore the title. "Now," Megan said, and Chen was already dialing. The captain's oxygen climbed one more point. 97. Stable. The monitors were singing the song of a man returned from the edge of something dark. Megan's fingers found the pulse point at his neck, strong, steady, the kind of pulse that meant the autonomic nervous system had stopped screaming. She allowed herself one measured breath, the kind of breath that could contain 18 years of civilian nursing and 20 years of something else entirely. The kind of breath that said she knew exactly what she'd just done and wasn't going to apologize for it. But what she didn't know was that Dr. Sterling had already made his decision. That in the moment she was stabilizing a patient's oxygen saturation, he was calculating his response, the calls he would make that evening, the board chair who owed him a favor, the handful of references she'd listed that weren't actually references at all anymore. He was thinking about how to frame this crisis as negligence on her part, how to rewrite the timeline, how to activate the network that had protected him before and would protect him again. A simple floor nurse who thought she could override his authority couldn't be allowed to survive this. The captain's eyes found Megan's one more time as the surgical team burst through the doors, as Sterling retreated into the background, as the entire mechanism of Mercy General's trauma protocol mobilized around one man whose life had just been measured in seconds and saved by someone nobody understood. He saw something in her face, not triumph. Not pride. Something harder to name than that. Something that looked like someone who had already survived the worst things the world could do. The monitor showed what Sterling's frozen hands could not accomplish. Sinus rhythm. The captain's chest rose with real breath, oxygen saturation climbing from 68 to 79 to 88, and Megan stepped back from the bedside without a word. She peeled off her gloves. The latex snapped like a whip in the sudden quiet of the trauma bay. Sterling's face transformed. Not into gratitude. Into something far more dangerous. Into rage that had nowhere to go but inward, where it metastasized into calculation. His hands had trembled. Hers had not. In front of 6 witnesses, the trauma team, the captain's family, the surgical resident who'd watched her bypass the entire chain of command and simply save a life, Sterling had become what he could not tolerate. Second. He turned away from the bedside, his jaw working silently, and walked out of the trauma bay without looking back. Megan didn't watch him go. She was already charting, her handwriting steady, documenting the needle decompression with clinical precision, location, gauge, technique, outcome. The medical record that would either protect her or condemn her, depending on who read it first. By 1847 hours, Sterling had made 4 phone calls. The first was to Richard Bancroft, the hospital board chair who'd approved Sterling's promotion to ER director 18 months ago in exchange for Sterling's promise to streamline patient throughput metrics. The favor had been implicit. Sterling never explicitly asked for anything. He simply said, "Richard, we have a protocol problem in the ER that's going to expose us to liability. Nurse insubordination. Repeated overrides of physician authority. I'm going to need the board's backing when I move forward." Bancroft, who'd built his reputation on protecting the hospital from litigation, heard the message beneath the words, "Fix this quietly or it becomes public." The second call was to HR, specifically to Margaret Chen, the director who'd inherited a system that valued institutional protection above all else. Sterling spoke with the voice of a man solving a problem, not seeking revenge. "I have documentation of 3 separate incidents where RN O'Brien has ignored direct orders. Today was the most egregious. She performed a procedure that is not within her scope of practice and happens to contradict my explicit instruction not to intervene. I understand she has references from various overseas medical contracts before she came here. I'd like her entire file pulled, and I'd like every reference contacted to see if there's a pattern of this kind of behavior." Chen, who'd learned long ago that the easiest way to survive hospital administration was to move problems out rather than solve them, agreed to have everything compiled by end of shift. The third call was to a legal contact Sterling kept for exactly this type of situation. A retired administrator who now worked as a consultant for hospitals defending against nursing board complaints. "I need someone to contact 6 references listed on an RN's application. Tell them we're conducting a standard background verification. Ask specifically about protocol violations, judgment issues, anything that suggests she thinks she knows better than the physician she works with. Frame it as routine. I'll send you the file within the hour." The fourth call was to himself, rehearsing what he would say to the captain when visiting hours ended. Sterling was many things, but he was not a fool. The captain would remember who stabilized his breathing. He would also remember who ordered Megan to stand down. Sterling needed to be the first voice telling the narrative. The captain had been sedated. His memory of the exact sequence of events would be hazy at best. Sterling would be generous. Magnanimous. He would explain that while Megan's instincts were good, she'd put herself and the patient at risk by acting without physician authorization. Thankfully, Sterling had been there to ensure proper protocol. The captain's family would believe him. They always did. By 1906 hours, a security guard named Marcus, who'd worked at Mercy General for 14 years and had never once been asked to escort an employee out of the building, was standing in the break room with a cardboard box in his hands, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Megan. Sterling's orders. HR confirmed it. You're being terminated effective immediately. For your own safety in the hospitals, we'll need your badge and your belongings from your locker." Marcus was old enough to know this wasn't standard procedure. Protocols required a formal meeting, written notice, a chance to respond. He kept his eyes on the tile floor. Megan finished washing her hands. She didn't dry them. She simply stood there for 4 seconds, water dripping from her fingertips, and when she finally moved, it was with the economy of someone who'd already made a dozen decisions in the past for seconds. She retrieved her locker contents in 3 minutes. A sweater. A phone charger. A water bottle with the Mercy General logo on it. And at the very bottom, tucked behind a pair of shoes she hadn't worn in 3 years, a pair of worn combat boots with sand still embedded in the laces. She held them for a moment. Just a moment. Then placed them in the box. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She looked at Marcus and said, "Tell them I'd make the same call every time," and walked out through the employee entrance into the Norfolk evening, the cardboard box pressed against her chest like a shield that had already failed her. 2 hours later, Megan sat at her kitchen table in a house that suddenly felt like a rental, the kind of place you stayed in temporarily until you figured out where you actually belonged. Rain hammered the windows in sheets, the kind of spring downpour that turned Norfolk streets into rivers, and her 15-year-old son, Marcus Jr., named after her brother, though his friends called him MJ, came down the stairs still in his school uniform, backpack over one shoulder, and stopped cold. "Mom? Why are you home early?" The question was simple. The answer was not. Megan sat with her hands folded on the table, the cardboard box on the floor beside her chair, and discovered that she had no words that wouldn't sound like the failure she felt. She couldn't tell him the hospital had terminated her. Not yet. Not without explaining why. And she couldn't explain why without telling him exactly what she'd been hiding for 15 years. That she wasn't just a nurse who'd worked overseas medical contracts. That she was a senior chief petty officer in the United States Navy. That she'd been trained to make decisions under fire. That she'd spent 20 years of her life making those decisions, and the nightmares from those decisions had nearly destroyed her, and she'd chosen to walk away from everything, her rank, her identity, her entire history, because the alternative was putting a gun in her mouth, and she couldn't do that to a 6-year-old boy who needed his mother more than the Navy needed another warrior. That she'd spent the last 15 years trying to be normal, trying to be quiet, trying to be the kind of mother who didn't carry classified memories in her chest and combat skills in her muscle memory. That today, in a moment of pure instinct, she'd forgotten to be normal. Mom. MJ's voice shifted, the way teenage boys' voices do when they're starting to understand that their parents are fragile. What happened? Megan pressed her eyes closed. 1 breath. 2. The sound of rain filling the silence between them. She opened her eyes and looked at her son, really looked at him, and realized that the person she'd been hiding from wasn't the Navy. It was him. She'd been hiding from the possibility that he would ever know who she actually was, that he would look at her and see a killer instead of a mother. I made a decision at work that my boss didn't like, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. And he decided I wasn't worth keeping around. It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the truth. But it was all she could manage, and even that cost her. Her hands had started shaking. Not from fear. From the effort of holding everything back. MJ did what teenagers do when confronted with their parents' pain, he turned away. But not to leave. He moved toward the garage. She heard the scrape of something heavy being moved, the shift of boxes, and then his footsteps returning. He was carrying a wooden case, the kind that belonged in a museum or a criminal evidence locker, dusty from 3 years of being hidden behind old paint cans and forgotten tools. Mom, he said, and his voice had changed. It had that quality of absolute certainty that only teenagers possessed, that bone-deep conviction that they understood something the adults had missed. They need to see these. Megan's breath stopped. The case was made of cherry wood, sealed with a brass latch, and she knew exactly what was inside without opening it. She knew because she'd bought it 15 years ago and hidden it the same day because she couldn't bear to look at it. Because every time she thought about opening it, she remembered who she'd been, and that person was someone she couldn't afford to be. MJ, put that back, she said, but her voice had no weight. It was already over. The moment her son picked up that case, every careful lie she'd constructed had begun to crack. He was already moving toward the door, the case tucked under his arm like a football. We're going back to the hospital. We are not. Mom. He turned back and looked at her with the kind of clarity that broke something in her chest. Whatever you've been carrying, you shouldn't have to carry it alone. The rain was a living thing by the time they reached Mercy General, pounding the parking lot like a judgment, and Megan followed her son into the building with the sense of walking toward something she couldn't stop. They made their way to the administrative wing where a closed-door emergency meeting was happening, where Sterling was explaining to hospital administrators why terminating a protocol-violating nurse was the only appropriate response. MJ didn't knock. He simply opened the conference room door, walked to the table, and set the wooden case down with enough force to make everyone in the room stop talking. The captain, awake now, still tethered to monitors but conscious, his eyes tracking every movement in the room, spoke first. His voice was rough from intubation, weighted with something that sounded like recognition, and he said it clearly enough that everyone heard, that senior chief petty officer O'Brien. The room went perfectly still. Her son disappeared into the garage at 8:19 p.m. Megan heard the metal scrape of old paint cans being moved, the hollow thud of cardboard boxes shifted aside. She stood at the kitchen sink, hands submerged in water that had gone cold, staring at nothing. The house was silent except for the refrigerator's rhythmic hum and the sound of her own breathing, shallow and controlled, the way she'd learned to breathe in the dark. Then footsteps. Boots on the kitchen tile. Her son emerged carrying a dusty wooden case, the kind that held precision instruments or valuables meant to be forgotten. His face had the look of someone who'd finally solved a puzzle he'd been turning over in his head for years. Mom, "They need to see these," he said. Not a question. Not a request. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The case sat between them like an accusation. "I found them behind the paint cans 2 years ago," he continued. "I never opened it. I waited for you to tell me. But you never did, and that guy just destroyed your career, and I'm not letting that happen without them knowing who you are." Megan turned from the sink, water dripping from her forearms. "We're not doing this." "We are." He was already moving toward the door, the case tucked under his arm like a football. "Get in the truck. Now." She followed him. Not because he commanded it, though his voice carried something she recognized, something she'd taught him without knowing it, but because some part of her had always known this moment would arrive. You can bury a life, but you can't bury it forever. The world has a way of digging things up. The drive to Mercy General took 14 minutes. Neither of them spoke. Rain hammered the windshield like it was trying to break through glass. Her son's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw set with the kind of determination that only comes from protecting someone you love. The parking lot was still lit, the ER entrance glowing like a beacon in the darkness. He parked in a handicap spot and didn't hesitate. Just grabbed the case and walked through the automatic doors like he owned the place. Megan followed 2 steps behind, her body moving on instinct while her mind tried to calculate exit strategies that no longer existed. The administrator's office was on the 3rd floor. They didn't check in. Her son just walked into the conference room where the hospital board was gathered, 7 people in business casual, papers spread across a mahogany table, mid-discussion about severance packages and liability exposure. Dr. Sterling stood near the window, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his face the color of old clay. "My mother isn't getting fired," her son said, and the room went still. He opened the case on the conference table. The medals caught the fluorescent light like they were alive. Navy Cross first, heavy and gold, the ribbon a cascade of blue and white and red. Then the Purple Heart, its enameled surface pristine despite the decades. Bronze Star with valor, the eagle wings spread as if ready for flight. One after another after another. The room didn't just go quiet. The silence became a physical presence, thick enough to breathe. Captain Reeves sat up in the hospital bed they'd wheeled into the conference room, still receiving 4 fluids, still pale, but alert now, alive. His eyes found Megan and held. "That's Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien," he said to the administrator. Not a statement. A confirmation. A reminder of hierarchy that existed long before hospital credentials. The door opened. A man in a naval dress uniform walked in, shoulders like bridge supports, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. His collar bore the insignia of a Navy SEAL captain. His name tape read Clayton. Behind him came 2 more officers in civilian clothes, FBI credentials already visible in their hands like they'd had them ready. Senior Chief O'Brien served 3 combat deployments across a 14-year career, Clayton said, his voice steady and official. The room was listening now with the desperation of people who understood they were witnessing something they didn't have context for. 17 lives saved under direct fire. 2 Purple Hearts for wounds sustained in the line of duty. A Bronze Star for valor during the assault on the Sangin River, where she shielded a local national child. He glanced at Reeves, the child who's now Captain Reeves, from a mortar strike that killed 3 other Marines around her. He lifted the Navy Cross between 2 fingers. Light moved across its surface like water. "And this?" The Navy Cross is awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. Fewer than 400 were awarded in the entire War on Terror. Senior Chief O'Brien earned hers by continuing operations with 2 puncture wounds to the abdomen and a fractured radius to coordinate evacuation of her entire 12-person unit under sustained fire. Dr. Sterling's face drained of color. Not the pale of surprise. The gray of someone watching everything collapse. One of the FBI agents stepped forward. "Dr. Marcus Sterling, we need to speak with you regarding fraudulent documentation of personnel files, falsification of employment records, and attempted obstruction of a federal investigation." The calls you made to the references listed in Ms. O'Brien's employment application were actually answered by NCIS officers maintaining her protected federal cover. That's a felony. I don't. Sterling's voice cracked. He tried again. I was just following hospital protocol. You fabricated 11 separate violations, the second agent said, pulling a phone from his pocket. We have recordings of calls to board members where you discussed financial compensation for expedited termination. That's fraud. That's conspiracy. That's federal. Handcuffs clicked. The sound was sharp and final, like the closing of a door that couldn't be reopened. Sterling's hands went behind his back with the automaticity of someone who suddenly understood they had no choice. The perp walk down the corridor took exactly 40 seconds. A nurse named Rodriguez, the same nurse who'd turned her back in the break room 2 days ago, stood silent as Sterling passed. Her eyes met Megan's from across the hallway. An apology lived in that glance. A moment too late. News of the arrest spread through Mercy General like current through water. By 11:13 p.m., one of the nurses on night shift had recorded Sterling being loaded into an FBI vehicle and posted it to the hospital's internal message board. By morning, it was everywhere. 6 months passed. The board disbanded the investigation into Megan's conduct and appointed her director of emergency medicine. The Navy and the hospital reached a settlement agreement that included a 15-bed VA wing dedicated to veteran care and a trauma center renovation funded by federal grants. Captain Reeves was cleared for full duty assignment. Dr. Sterling was arraigned on 3 federal counts of fraud and conspiracy. Megan stood at her new desk on her first day as director, pinning her credentials to the wall. The placard read her rank and title. Beside it, she placed the worn combat boots, the same pair she'd buried in her locker for 17 years. She polished them first. The leather was cracked but the soles were solid, treaded still with traces of dust from roads on the other side of the world. Her son's photograph sat in a frame on the corner. Him at 17, the morning after the hospital, sitting on the front porch steps with sunlight in his hair, finally understanding his mother. A nurse knocked. Director O'Brien? We have a trauma incoming. Gunshot wound to the thoracic cavity. ETA 8 minutes. On my way, Megan said. She didn't change her clothes. The scrubs she wore were enough. The boots stayed on the desk, a reminder of where she came from and why she chose to stay. She walked down the hallway toward the trauma bay, and every person she passed, the ones who'd abandoned her, the ones who'd believed her competence, the ones who'd watched her transformation, recognized something in her bearing that had nothing to do with titles or credentials. They recognized a warrior who'd chosen to heal instead of destroy, and who'd never asked for recognition for it. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of and choosing restraint anyway. Every single day. Every single patient. Every single moment. By month 8, Dr. Sterling had accepted a plea deal. Federal prison was off the table. He'd get 18 months in a minimum security facility and permanent loss of his medical license. But before that, before sentencing, he needed to work. His attorney required documented employment to present any chance at leniency. 6 months later, he was behind a folding table at a strip mall urgent care in Tucson, Arizona, selling supplemental health insurance policies for $14 an hour. The name tag read Steve. When patients asked if he'd ever been a doctor, he changed the subject. When anyone called him doctor, he flinched and stared at his hands for a long moment. Megan didn't watch this unfold. She was too busy building something instead of destroying it. The VA wing opened in December with 17 beds for homeless veterans and trauma patients with complex PTSD. She hired nurses who understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds. She built a culture where protocol existed to save lives, not to protect reputations. And on the day the new wing opened, Captain Reeves stood in dress uniform beside her while photographers took pictures. His hand found her shoulder, a gesture of respect between two people who understood the weight of keeping others alive. "Thank you, Senior Chief," he said quietly. "You're alive," she answered. "That's all the thanks I need." Sometimes the bravest warriors don't carry guns. Sometimes they carry stethoscopes and a 17-year secret and the willingness to break their own carefully constructed silence so others can see who they are. Hit that like button if you appreciate the nurses and healthcare workers in your life. Drop a comment if you've ever worked in medicine or know someone who has. Subscribe and let's see what happens next.